Hello and welcome back to the Crime Folio. In the natural world, the black widow spider is infamous. She draws a mate into her web, and after the union is complete, she consumes him. Tonight, we explore the human equivalent of this chilling predator. We delve into the stories of women who turned the sacred vows of marriage into death sentences and the comfort of home into a tomb. Their weapon was not a knife or a gun, but trust, intimacy, and patience. Their motive, a cold and calculated greed. Case 1. The Case of Belle Gunness. To understand the monster, one must first travel back to the cold, hard soil of Norway. She was born Brynhild Paulsdatter Storset in 1859, in the small lakeside village of Selbu. She was the youngest of 8 children, born into a life of rural poverty. By all accounts, she was strong, ambitious, and possessed a quiet intensity that set her apart. Local legend, perhaps a story created in hindsight to explain the darkness that would later erupt, tells of a pivotal, violent incident. As a teenager, Brynhild attended a country dance. She was pregnant out of wedlock, and a man, for reasons lost to time, kicked her brutally in the abdomen, causing her to miscarry the child. The man, from a wealthy family, was never prosecuted. According to the folklore, something in Brynhild changed that day. The warmth and softness of her youth calcified into something hard, cold, and vengeful. This story, whether true or not, serves as a fitting prologue to a life that would become defined by a profound and murderous contempt for men. In 1881, like so many of her generation seeking escape and opportunity, Brynhild emigrated to America. She changed her name to something more American, more approachable: Belle. She joined her sister, Nellie, in Chicago and found work as a domestic servant. She was a physically imposing woman, standing nearly 6 feet tall and weighing over 200 pounds. She was not classically beautiful, but she was strong, capable, and possessed a plain-faced charm that seemed to put people at ease. She was the image of a sturdy, dependable Norwegian farm girl. In 1884, she married a fellow Norwegian immigrant, Mads Ditlev Anton Svendsen. They settled in Chicago and, for a time, appeared to be living the modest immigrant dream. They opened a confectionery shop. They had children, 4 of them: Caroline, Axel, Myrtle, and Lucy. But their dream was stalked by an almost unbelievable string of tragedies. The confectionery shop, after a year of struggle, mysteriously burned to the ground. Belle and Mads collected the insurance money. Then the children began to die. Caroline and Axel, both infants, perished from what was diagnosed as acute colitis. The symptoms of acute colitis: nausea, fever, diarrhea, and abdominal cramps are remarkably similar to the symptoms of certain types of poisoning. With each death, Belle and Mads collected on a small life insurance policy. The pattern of convenient death and financial gain culminated in 1900. On July 30th, Mads Svendsen died. It was, coincidentally, the very day that 2 life insurance policies he held were set to overlap. One was expiring, and the new one was beginning. His death on this specific day guaranteed a double payout. The cause of death was officially listed as an enlarged heart. Belle told doctors he had come home with a headache and she had given him quinine powder for it. She later claimed he had been poisoned by his own family members, who wanted to get their hands on the insurance money. But one of Mads's relatives was deeply suspicious and demanded an inquiry. A coroner's inquest was held. 2 different death certificates existed for Mads Svendsen. The first, from Belle's family doctor, cited heart failure. The second, from the coroner who examined the body, suggested strychnine poisoning. Yet, in the end, with no definitive proof and with a grieving widow presenting a picture of tragic loss, the original diagnosis of natural causes stood. Belle Gunness collected the insurance money, a sum of approximately $8 500 a small fortune at the turn of the 20th century. With her newfound wealth, Belle decided to leave the painful memories of Chicago behind. She moved her two surviving children, Myrtle and Lucy, and a new foster daughter named Jenny Olson, to the quiet, rural community of LaPorte, Indiana. In 1901, she purchased a 48-acre farm on the outskirts of town. It was a handsome property with a large farmhouse, a barn, and, crucially, a sizable hog pen. To her new neighbors, she was Belle Gunness, a respectable, hard-working widow, a devout Lutheran who was simply trying to build a new life for her children. But a widow's life was difficult. In April 1902, Belle married again. Her new husband was Peter Gunness, a local butcher and a fellow Norwegian immigrant. He was a kind, gentle man, a widower himself with two infant daughters. One of his daughters died in his care shortly before he met Belle. The other, an infant, came to live with him on the farm. But this new chapter of domestic bliss was to be brutally short. Just 1 week after their wedding, Peter's infant daughter died while alone in the house with Belle. The cause was listed as uncertain. Then, a mere 8 months later, in December 1902, Peter Gunness himself met a bizarre and violent end. Belle's story was that she had been boiling brine on the stove to pickle meat. She claimed that a large, heavy sausage grinding machine, which had been inexplicably stored on a high shelf directly above the stove, fell from its perch and struck Peter squarely on the head, killing him instantly. His body then fell into the pot of scalding liquid. When a neighbor came to check on the family, he found Belle in a state of frantic, theatrical grief, cradling her two children and wailing about the terrible accident. Once again, suspicions arose. Peter's family and friends did not believe the story. How could a heavy machine simply fall? Why was it stored in such a precarious place? A coroner's inquest was convened. Peter's skull had been so thoroughly crushed that many suspected he had been struck with a meat cleaver. But Belle Gunness was a masterful performer. She appeared before the all-male jury, pregnant with Peter's child, dressed in mourning clothes, and wept. She painted a picture of a tragic, freak accident that had robbed her of her beloved husband. Her performance was so convincing, so heartbreaking, that the jury concluded that Peter Gunness had indeed died by accidental means. No charges were filed. Belle, once again a widow, collected on her husband's $3,000 life insurance policy. A few months later, she gave birth to their son, Philip. With the farm, a growing family, and a fresh infusion of cash, Belle Gunness now began the final and most prolific phase of her murderous career. She was no longer content to wait for husbands to die. She decided to lure them to her. She began placing Lonely Hearts advertisements in the matrimonial columns of Norwegian-language newspapers across the Midwest, papers read by the very demographic she sought. Lonely, hardworking, and trusting Scandinavian immigrant farmers and laborers. Her ads were a work of manipulative genius. They read like a dream come true. Comely widow who owns a large farm in one of the finest districts in LaPorte County, Indiana, desires to make the acquaintance of a gentleman of good character, and who is well provided for. Object: matrimony. She presented herself as a woman of means, a landowner seeking not a man's money, but his companionship. The letters poured in. Belle would correspond with multiple men at once, her letters full of warmth, promises of a comfortable home, and a loving partnership. She was a gifted writer, her words weaving a web of domestic fantasy. But as the correspondence deepened, a crucial condition would be introduced. She would ask the suitor to prove his sincerity. He must sell his assets, liquidate his savings, and bring the cash with him to her farm. This, she explained, was to prove that his intentions were honorable and to contribute to their shared future. She would often ask them to bring between $1,000 and $20,000, promising to merge their funds and live a life of ease. She also gave them a stern warning. Tell no one where you are going. This was a private matter between them. Dozens of lonely, hopeful men answered the call. They sold their farms in Wisconsin, their businesses in Minnesota, their homesteads in the Dakotas. They packed their life savings into satchels and boarded trains for LaPorte, Indiana, believing they were on their way to meet their future wife. They were met at the station by Belle or her hired hand. They were brought to the farm. They enjoyed a fine, home-cooked meal, and then they vanished. John Moe of Elbow Lake, Minnesota, disappeared in 1907 after writing to his family that he had arrived at the Gunnis farm. Henry Gerhold of Scandinavia, Wisconsin, sold his farm, told friends he was going to marry a wealthy widow in Indiana, and was never seen again. Olaf Svenherud, a young Norwegian from Chicago, withdrew his life savings and traveled to LaPorte. His last known letter was sent from the Gunnis farm. The list went on and on. Men would arrive in town, be seen with Belle Gunnis for a day or two, and then simply cease to exist. When concerned relatives wrote to Belle inquiring about their missing loved ones, she would respond with practiced ease. She would claim the man had been there but had left for parts unknown, sometimes implying he had run off with her money. She was the victim, she claimed, a trusting widow taken advantage of by unscrupulous men. To help with the immense workload on the farm, both the agricultural labor and the darker, more gruesome tasks, Belle hired a series of farmhands. One of them was a man named Ray Lamphere. Lamphere was a rough, simple man who became utterly infatuated with his powerful employer. He was deeply in love with her, and deeply jealous of the steady stream of suitors who came to call. He became her confidant, her muscle, and, authorities would later allege, her accomplice. He dug holes in the hog pen, tilled the garden, and repaired the fences, all while watching the men who came to replace him in Belle's affections disappear one by one. His jealousy eventually became a problem for Belle. She fired him in early 1908 and had him arrested for trespassing, claiming he was a threat to her and her family. He was a loose end she needed to tie up. The beginning of the end came not from the local police, but from a concerned brother hundreds of miles away. In early 1908, Asel Helgelian, the brother of a missing suitor named Andrew Helgelian from South Dakota, wrote to Belle. Andrew had sold his farm, taken his life savings, and gone to marry Belle in January. His family had not heard from him since. Asel was persistent. He did not believe Belle's story that Andrew had left. He informed her in a letter that, if he did not hear from his brother soon, he would be coming to LaPorte himself to investigate. The threat of Asel Helgelian's arrival seems to have been the catalyst for Belle's final, desperate act. She knew the clock was ticking. She began to put her affairs in order. On April 27, 1908, she visited her lawyer in town. She drafted a will, leaving her entire estate to her children. She complained to the lawyer that Ray Lamphere, her fired handyman, had been threatening her. She claimed he had threatened to burn her house down with her and her family inside. She was, it seems, preemptively creating a scapegoat. That same day, she made a large withdrawal from her bank account. In the pre-dawn hours of April 28, 1908, a fire erupted at the Gunnis farmhouse. The blaze was swift and intensely hot, consuming the wooden structure with an unnatural ferocity. By the time neighbors arrived, the house was a roaring inferno, its roof collapsing into a fiery pit. After the flames were extinguished, investigators searching the smoking rubble in the basement made a grim discovery. They found 4 bodies huddled together. They were assumed to be Belle Gunnis and her 3 children, Myrtle, Lucy, and Philip. The initial conclusion was a tragic murder-suicide or a mass murder committed by the crazed Ray Lamphere, just as Bell had predicted. Lamphere was immediately arrested, but as investigators examined the scene more closely, disturbing questions arose. The adult body, presumed to be Bell, was headless. The head was never found in the ashes. More strangely, when the town coroner, Dr. J. H. Meyer, took measurements of the headless corpse, he found it was significantly shorter and lighter than the famously large and robust Bell Gunness. The official weight of the corpse was estimated at no more than 150 pounds. A full 50 to 75 pounds lighter than Bell was known to be. The community was divided. Had Bell Gunness died in the fire, her body so badly burned that it shrank? Or had she murdered a stand-in, planted the body, and used the fire to fake her own death and escape? The arrival of Asle Helgelian, Andrew's determined brother, turned the tide. He did not believe for a second that Bell was dead. He was convinced she had murdered his brother and fled. He began talking to Joe Maxon, a man who had briefly worked for Bell after Lamphere was fired. Maxon told Helgelian a chilling story. He said that Bell had ordered him to haul load after load of dirt to a specific corner of the hog pen, leveling off several large, soft depressions in the ground. Bell, he said, had called these pits garbage holes. Armed with this information, on May 3, 1908, Asle Helgelian and a group of men went to the Gunness farm with shovels. They began to dig in the soft earth of the hog pen. What they unearthed was a scene of unimaginable horror. The first thing they found was a burlap sack containing the dismembered body of a woman. It was Jenny Olson, Bell's foster daughter, who had gone off to college years before. Then they found the body of Andrew Helgelian. And then another, and another. The farm was not a farm. It was a human slaughterhouse. Over the next several days, the property was transformed into a massive excavation site. From the hog pen, the garbage pits, and the soft earth of the garden, they unearthed a charnel house of horrors. They found whole bodies, some wrapped in oilcloth, and they found parts. Torsos, severed limbs, and heads, all preserved in the damp soil. In total, they officially identified the remains of at least a dozen people, but the true number was likely far higher, with estimates running to over 40 victims. Most were middle-aged men, the lonely suitors who had come seeking a wife. But there were also women and children. The community of Lockport, and indeed the entire nation, was gripped by the story of the Indiana ogress and her murder farm. Ray Lamphere went on trial for murder and arson. The prosecution argued he had killed Bell and her children before setting the fire. The defense argued that Bell was still alive and that Lamphere was her scapegoat. The jury was swayed by the mystery of the headless corpse. They acquitted Lamphere of murder but found him guilty of arson. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison. A year later, Lamphere died in prison of tuberculosis. But before he died, he reportedly gave a deathbed confession to his cellmate, a man named Harry Myers. He laid out the entire horrific story. He claimed Bell had killed dozens of men. He described his role: meeting the men at the train station, helping Bell dispose of the bodies, and digging the graves. He detailed her methods. She would often poison their coffee with strychnine during their first meal. And if that didn't work, she would wait until they were asleep and split their skulls with a meat cleaver. He insisted he had never killed anyone himself but had been her unwilling, terrified accomplice. And he confirmed what many had long suspected: Bell Gunness was not dead. He claimed she had drugged her own children, smothered them, and then murdered a female vagrant she had lured to the farm to serve as her body double. After setting the fire, she had fled with her fortune, a sum estimated to be as high as $250,000, the equivalent of over $7 million today. Did Bell Gunness escape? The mystery has never been solved. Years later, A set of dental bridgework was found in the ashes of the farmhouse, and a dentist identified it as work he had done for Belle, leading some to conclude she did die in the fire. But sightings of a woman matching her description persisted for decades, reported from all over the country. The legend of Belle Gunness endures, a chilling tale of a woman who turned a plot of Indiana soil into one of the most prolific killing fields in American history. Her farm was a perfect trap, a place that promised the American dream of land and family, but delivered only a swift, brutal death and an unmarked grave in a pigsty. Case 2. The case of Nanny Doss, the giggling granny. Where Belle Gunness was a creature of brute force and rustic cunning, a physical giant who overwhelmed her victims, our next subject was the antithesis. She was a small, cherubic woman with a perpetual smile, a woman whose neighbors saw her as the picture of grandmotherly warmth. But beneath the soft, giggling facade was a heart as cold and sterile as a laboratory beaker, and a pantry well stocked with her poison of choice. She was not searching for wealth, though she gladly accepted it. She was searching for something far more elusive and, in her mind, far more important. The perfect love, the kind she read about in the pages of cheap romance magazines. And any man who failed to live up to that impossible, pulp fiction ideal would find his final chapter written in arsenic. Her story begins not with Nanny, but with Nancy. She was born Nancy Hazel in 1905, in the isolated community of Blue Mountain, Alabama. Her childhood was not a happy one. Her father, James Hazel, was a stern, controlling man who cast a long, oppressive shadow over the household. He was a man of harsh restrictions and little affection, forbidding his 5 daughters from attending dances, wearing makeup, or engaging in the simple social rituals of youth. He saw the outside world as a source of corruption and kept his daughters isolated, their lives circumscribed by farm labor and his rigid rules. It was a childhood devoid of warmth, fostering in young Nancy a deep-seated craving for escape and a romantic fantasy life that would curdle into a murderous pathology. A pivotal event occurred when she was 7 years old. While traveling on a train, it stopped abruptly, and Nancy was thrown forward, striking her head hard against a metal seat bar. For months afterward, she suffered from debilitating headaches, blackouts, and periods of deep depression. This head injury, her family would later claim, changed her. It seemed to create a permanent disconnect, an emotional short-circuit that may have contributed to her later inability to form genuine attachments or feel authentic empathy. With her social life curtailed and her education limited by her father's insistence that farm work took precedence, Nancy's only escape was vicarious. Her mother was a devoted reader of Lonely Hearts columns and romance magazines like True Romance. Young Nancy would devour these stories, her imagination filled with tales of dashing heroes, passionate embraces, and the promise of a perfect, all-consuming love. The stark contrast between the grim reality of her life and the technicolor fantasy of the magazines created a dangerous schism in her mind. She came to believe that this perfect love was not just a fantasy. It was a destiny she was entitled to. Her first chance to escape her father's control came when she was 16. She took a job at a linen factory, and there she met Charlie Braggs. He was her first beau, her first ticket out. They married in 1921. But the reality of marriage to a quiet, hard-working man quickly fell short of her romantic ideals. They had 4 daughters in 4 years: Melvina, Florine, and 2 others. The marriage was a difficult one, strained by the pressures of poverty and the constant presence of Charlie's unmarried mother, whom Nanny deeply disliked. Then the suspicious deaths began. In 1927, 2 of their middle daughters, still infants, died suddenly and mysteriously. The cause was diagnosed as food poisoning. Nanny collected small life insurance policies on both. A short time later, Charlie's mother, who had been a source of tension in the house, also died. Charlie, by now deeply unnerved by the string of deaths surrounding his wife, became convinced she was trying to poison him. He packed a bag, took their eldest daughter, Melvina, and fled, leaving Nanny with their other surviving daughter, Florine. The divorce was finalized in 1928. Her first attempt at perfect love had ended in failure and death. Undeterred, Nanny began her search anew, this time turning to the very source of her fantasies, the Lonely Hearts columns. In 1929, she met her second husband, Robert Franklin "Frank" Harrelson, a 23-year-old factory worker from Jacksonville, Florida. He was a handsome man, but he was also a violent alcoholic with a criminal record for assault. He was another bitter disappointment, another leading man who failed to follow the script. Their 16-year marriage was a turbulent affair, punctuated by his drunkenness and her growing resentment. During this time, Nanny's surviving daughters from her first marriage grew up. The eldest, Melvina, gave birth to a son, Robert, in 1943. 2 years later, in 1945, after a visit from her grandmother Nanny, the healthy 2-year-old boy died suddenly. The cause was listed as asphyxia from unknown causes. Melvina, who had been at work, was devastated and deeply suspicious. She remembered seeing Nanny stick a hatpin into the baby's head. Later that same year, Melvina gave birth to a second child, a daughter. But Melvina herself died shortly after childbirth, under mysterious circumstances. Nanny, ever the grieving matriarch, collected the life insurance money from a policy she had recently taken out on her daughter. Her husband, Frank Harrelson, was the next to go. In September 1945, after a night of heavy drinking, he flew into a rage and, according to Nanny, assaulted her. The next day he was dead. Nanny told everyone he had died of a stomach ailment. The truth, she would later confess, was that she had been systematically poisoning his corn whiskey with rat poison. Her second search for love was over. After Frank's death, Nanny moved around, eventually settling in Lexington, North Carolina. Her search continued. In 1947, she met her third husband, Arlie Lanning, through yet another Lonely Hearts Club. Like Frank, Arlie was an alcoholic and a womanizer, another romantic hero with feet of clay. The pattern repeated itself. After a short and unhappy marriage, Arlie died in 1952 of what was diagnosed as heart failure, his symptoms conveniently mimicking a severe case of the flu. The town doctor, overwhelmed with a local flu epidemic, signed the death certificate without suspicion. Shortly after his death, the couple's home, which had been left to Nanny's sister Dovey in Arlie's will, mysteriously burned to the ground. Nanny, who had insured the house in her own name, collected the insurance money. Now a 3-time widow, Nanny's trail of death began to widen, consuming her own family. With her house gone, she moved in with her sister, Dovey, who was bedridden with an illness. Soon after Nanny's arrival, Dovey died in her sleep. After her sister's death, Nanny went to live with her elderly mother, Lovenia. Not long after, Lovenia broke her hip in a fall. Nanny became her dedicated caretaker. Within a few weeks, Lovenia was dead, too. For Nanny Doss, death was simply a convenient tool for household management. Her appetite for matrimony, however, was insatiable. Before Arlie Lanning was even cold in his grave, Nanny had joined a singles club called the Diamond Circle Club and met her fourth husband, Richard L. Morton of Emporia, Kansas. Unlike the others, Morton was not an alcoholic, but he was a philanderer. He failed the fidelity test of her romantic fantasy. The marriage lasted only a few months. In early 1953, Richard Morton died of a supposed stomach ailment. His 79-year-old mother, who lived with them, made the fatal mistake of being a minor inconvenience. 3 days after her son's death, she also died. By now, Nanny was in her late 40s. Her string of dead husbands and relatives had raised no alarms. She had perfected her method, moving from town to town, leaving a trail of quiet, unexplained, natural deaths behind her. In June 1953, she found her fifth and final husband, Samuel Doss of Tulsa, Oklahoma. Samuel was, by all accounts, a good man. He was a devout Nazarene, a teetotaler, a man of quiet, stable habits. He was not a philanderer or a drunkard. He was, it seemed, the respectable man Nanny had supposedly been searching for. But he made 2 fatal errors. First, he was frugal and controlling with money. Second, and perhaps more unforgivably in Nanny's eyes, he forbade her from reading her beloved romance magazines, believing them to be sinful trash. He had punctured her fantasy. He had to go. In September 1954, Samuel was admitted to the hospital with severe flu-like symptoms. He had been poisoned, but not fatally. The hospital doctors diagnosed a severe digestive tract infection and, after a 23-day stay, they managed to save his life. He was discharged on October 5th. Nanny, ever the doting wife, was there to bring him home. She promised to nurse him back to health. Her first act of nursing was to bake him one of his favorite dishes, a rich prune cake. She served him a generous slice. What Samuel didn't know was that the cake contained enough arsenic to kill a horse. He died that same evening. This time, however, there was a problem. Samuel Doss's physician, Dr. D.E. Dixon, was deeply suspicious. It was highly unusual for a patient to make a full recovery in the hospital only to die within hours of returning home. The symptoms were too sudden, too violent. Dr. Dixon refused to sign the death certificate without an autopsy. He had just unwittingly signed Nanny Doss's arrest warrant. The autopsy revealed the horrifying truth. Samuel Doss's body was saturated with arsenic, enough to have killed him several times over. The police were called. Nanny was brought in for questioning. At first, she played the part of the grieving widow, the sweet, harmless old woman who couldn't possibly be involved in such a thing. But under persistent questioning, her composure cracked. And then, she began to talk. And as she talked, she smiled. And then she giggled. The confession that spilled out was a stunning litany of murder, recounted with a cheerful, almost girlish demeanor that horrified the seasoned detectives. She confessed to killing Samuel Doss because he was too boring. She confessed to killing Richard Morton because he was unfaithful. She confessed to killing Arlie Lanning because he was a drunk. She confessed to killing Frank Harrelson for the same reason. She admitted to killing her mother, her sister, her grandson, and one of her mothers-in-law. The only deaths she denied were those of her 2 infant daughters decades earlier. The press descended, captivated by the shocking contrast between her appearance and her actions. They dubbed her the giggling granny, the jolly black widow. She seemed to relish the attention, smiling and joking with reporters. When asked about her motive, she gave an answer that was, in its own twisted way, the absolute truth. She said she was searching for the perfect mate, the real romance in life. She wasn't a monster, she seemed to believe. She was just a hopeless romantic. Faced with a mountain of evidence and her own detailed confession, Nanny Doss pleaded guilty to the murder of Samuel Doss. The state of Oklahoma, unwilling to seek the death penalty for a woman, sentenced her to life in prison in 1955. She showed no remorse. In prison, she worked in the laundry and continued to read her romance stories, the fantasy world that had cost at least 11 people their lives. She died of leukemia in the prison hospital ward in 1965. Nanny Doss was a unique kind of predator. Her murders were not crimes of passion. They were acts of editorial convenience. When the men in her life failed to live up to the flawless heroes in her magazines, she simply wrote them out of the story, her pen a box of rat poison, her ink the sweet taste of a prune cake. She was a woman who loved the idea of love more than she could ever love a person. A black widow who killed not for money or for revenge, but for the sake of a perfect, unattainable dream. Case 3. The case of Stacey Castor, the antifreeze killer. The black widow archetype is often a creature of a bygone era, a figure from a grainy black and white past. But evil evolves. It adapts to new technologies, new environments, new methods of concealment. Our next case brings us into the 21st century, to a quiet suburban cul-de-sac in upstate New York. Here, the weapon of choice was not arsenic sprinkled from a spice tin, but a common household chemical, its sweet, deceptive taste masking a slow and agonizing death. And the predator was not a hulking farm woman or a giggling granny, but a modern, seemingly loving wife and mother whose capacity for betrayal would reach a depth that is almost incomprehensible. Stacey Castor lived in Liverpool, a suburb of Syracuse, New York. To her friends and neighbors, she was a friendly, well-liked woman, a dedicated mother to her 2 daughters, Ashley and Bree Wallace. Her life, however, had been marked by what appeared to be profound tragedy. In early 2000, her first husband, Michael Wallace, the father of her 2 girls, fell ill. He seemed to have a persistent, hacking cough, a general malaise that doctors struggled to diagnose. His health declined rapidly. One day, his family encouraged him to go to the hospital, but he refused, insisting he would go the next day. He never made it. He died at home at the age of 38. The official cause of death was listed as a heart attack. At the time, no one suspected foul play. The family was devastated but accepted the cruel randomness of fate. Stacey Wallace became Stacey Castor, a grieving widow left to raise her 2 young daughters alone. For 5 years, she played the part of the strong next door. She is the friendly neighbor, the devoted mother, the grieving widow whose quiet strength in the face of tragedy earns her the community's sympathy and admiration. She operates not in a remote farmhouse, but in the sterile, sunlit suburbs of modern America. And her poison of choice is not a powder from a dusty shelf, but a common household chemical, a sweet-tasting liquid found in any garage. This is the story of a woman who perfected the art of the public griever, a woman who wielded a turkey baster like a weapon and nearly sent her own child to prison for her crimes. The story unfolds in the quiet suburbs of Syracuse, New York. In the late summer of 2005, the world of Stacey Castor was, for the second time in her life, shattered by sudden tragedy. On the afternoon of August 22nd, Stacey placed a frantic call to 911. Her voice was panicked, breathless. Her husband, 47-year-old David Castor, was locked in their bedroom, she said. He had been depressed, despondent over his father's recent death. He wasn't answering her. She was terrified he had harmed himself. When sheriff's deputies arrived at the neat, unremarkable home in Clay, New York, Stacey led them to the bedroom. The door was locked. They forced it open. Inside, they found David Castor lying naked on the bed. He was dead. On the nightstand next to him was a half-empty glass containing a bright green liquid. Nearby was a container of antifreeze. The scene appeared to be a textbook suicide. Stacey Castor, overcome with grief, collapsed into the arms of a deputy. She was a widow, again. Detective Sergeant Dominic Spinelli of the Onondaga County Sheriff's Office was one of the first investigators on the scene. From the very beginning, something felt wrong. The scene was too neat, too staged. David Castor was a mechanic by trade. He knew what antifreeze was, and he would have known that suicide by ethylene glycol poisoning is a slow, agonizingly painful way to die. It didn't fit the profile of a typical suicide. But it was Stacy's demeanor that truly set off Spinelli's internal alarms. She was emotional, certainly, but her grief seemed performative, a script she was following. There was a cold, watchful intelligence behind her eyes that didn't match resilient single mother. Then, in 2005, she married again. Her new husband was David Castor, the owner of an air conditioning and heating installation company. He was a good man who loved Stacy and treated her daughters as his own. They bought a house together, and it seemed that Stacy had finally found a new chapter of happiness. But just as with her first husband, this happiness was to be shockingly brief. On the afternoon of August 22, 2005, the Onondaga County 911 dispatch center received a frantic call. It was Stacy Castor. She was crying, her voice tight with panic. She told the dispatcher that her husband, David, had locked himself in their bedroom after an argument and wasn't answering her. She was worried he had harmed himself. When sheriff's deputies arrived, they kicked in the bedroom door. The scene inside was one of quiet, grim finality. David Castor, 48, was lying naked on the bed. He was dead. On the nightstand next to him was a glass half full of a bright green liquid and a container of antifreeze. At first glance, it appeared to be a clear-cut case of suicide. The deputies found what they believed to be a suicide note in a nearby trash can, typed and unsigned, detailing David's despair over his father's recent death from cancer. Stacy, playing the part of the distraught wife, told investigators that David had been depressed and had been drinking heavily. The case seemed open and shut. A man, overcome by grief, had taken his own life in a painful and unusual way. But for the lead investigator, Onondaga County Sheriff Sergeant Michael Norton, something about the scene felt wrong. It was too neat, too staged. He had worked dozens of suicides, and they were rarely so tidy. He looked at the glass of antifreeze on the nightstand. There were no fingerprints on it. A person committing suicide, especially one who was drunk and depressed, would not likely think to wipe their fingerprints off the glass they were drinking from. It was a small detail, but it was a dissonant note in an otherwise simple melody of suicide. Norton's professional skepticism was piqued. He ordered a full forensic workup of the scene and an autopsy. The autopsy results turned a suspicion into a certainty. The medical examiner, Dr. Robert Stoppacher, determined that David Castor had died from ethylene glycol poisoning, the primary component of antifreeze. But he also found evidence that suggested this was not a simple suicide. The poison had been ingested, but the level of damage to David's esophagus and stomach was not as severe as would be expected from drinking that much antifreeze. Dr. Stoppacher also noted turkey basters were found in the kitchen trash. He proposed a chilling new theory. David Castor had not willingly drunk the poison. He had been force-fed it, likely through a turkey baster, while he was intoxicated and incapacitated. This was not a suicide. This was a homicide. With the case now a murder investigation, the focus turned squarely on the only other person in the house, Stacy Castor. Investigators began to dig into her past, and the 2000 death of her first husband, Michael Wallace, which had been ruled a heart attack, suddenly looked very different. The parallels were too striking to ignore. Two healthy, middle-aged husbands, both dying unexpectedly, leaving Stacy a widow with a substantial insurance payout. Sergeant Norton and his team made a momentous decision. They would seek a court order to exhume Michael Wallace's body. When Stacy learned of the exhumation, she maintained her composure, but her actions betrayed a growing desperation. She knew the net was closing in. If the authorities found poison in Michael's body, she would be facing 2 murder charges. She needed a scapegoat. She needed someone to take the fall. And in a decision of almost unimaginable cruelty, she decided that person would be her own child. Her target was her eldest daughter, Ashley Wallace. In September 2007, 2 years after David's death and shortly after Michael's body was exhumed, Stacy's daughters, Ashley and Bree, were at home. Stacy, feigning a motherly concern, suggested the three of them should drink together a mix of vodka, orange juice, and Spertetto honor the memory of their father and stepfather. She prepared the drinks in the kitchen and brought them to her daughters. Ashley took one sip and immediately spit it out, complaining that it tasted disgusting. Stacy, ever the caring mother, told her to just down it. Ashley, trusting her mother, took a few more sips but couldn't finish it. The next day, Ashley was at school when she began to feel violently ill. She came home and went to her room. Stacy followed her, offering her another glass of what she said was Sprite. The following afternoon, her younger sister, Bree, found Ashley lying semi-conscious in her bed. She was barely able to speak. Beside her on the nightstand was a bottle of pills and a typed letter. It was a suicide note. Bree, terrified, called 911. Ashley was rushed to the hospital in critical condition, her organs failing. She had been poisoned with a massive dose of painkillers and sleeping pills, washed down with vodka. She was just hours from death. But while doctors fought to save her life, investigators read the note she had supposedly written. It was a 750-word confession. In rambling, emotional prose, the note described how Ashley felt responsible for her father's and stepfather's deaths. "I am the one who killed them," the note read. "I hated them both. I watched them die and it was the worst thing. It was my fault." The note was a perfect narrative, a neat little package that explained everything the hysteria she projected. The autopsy on David Castor confirmed the cause of death: ethylene glycol poisoning. The medical examiner also made a crucial finding that deepened the mystery. He found evidence of a turkey baster having been used to force-feed the antifreeze into David, suggesting he may have been too intoxicated or incapacitated to drink it himself. This was no longer a simple suicide. It was a suspicious death. The investigation turned its full attention to the only other person in the house that day: the grieving widow, Stacy Castor. To understand Stacy, the investigators had to look back at her first marriage. In 1990, she had married her high school sweetheart, Michael Wallace. They had 2 daughters together, Ashley and Bree. To the outside world, they were a happy, normal family. But in the winter of 2000, Michael, a healthy man in his late 30s, fell suddenly and violently ill. He was in and out of the hospital for weeks with a mysterious, undiagnosed ailment that caused his lungs to fill with fluid and his body to swell. He was unsteady on his feet, coughing uncontrollably. Doctors were baffled. On January 11, 2000, his own daughter, Ashley, then 12 years old, found him dead in their home. The cause of death was ruled a heart attack. Stacy Wallace, at 32, was a young widow left to raise 2 daughters alone. She collected a substantial life insurance policy. 3 years later, she met David Castor. He was the owner of an air conditioning installation and repair company, a kind and stable man who adored Stacy and her daughters. They married in 2003. Stacy began working as his office manager, taking control of the company's finances. Now, just 2 years into their marriage, David was dead, and Stacy was once again the sole beneficiary of a life insurance policy and the inheritor of his business and estate. The pattern was too symmetrical to be a coincidence. Sergeant Spinelli and his team made a bold decision. They needed to know if Michael Wallace had really died of a heart attack. In September 2005, they secured a court order to exhume his body. Michael Wallace had been buried for 5 years. The investigators waited anxiously as the forensic toxicologists conducted their tests on the decomposed remains. The results were a bombshell. Michael Wallace's body contained lethal levels of ethylene glycol. He had not died of a heart attack. He had been poisoned. The same poison that killed David Castor had killed Michael Wallace. The odds of a woman's two husbands dying in the exact same rare and horrific manner, 5 years apart, were astronomically small. Stacy Castor was no longer a person of interest. She was the prime and only suspect in a double homicide. The investigators began to build their case, but it was circumstantial. They had a motive, financial gain, and a pattern, but no direct evidence tying Stacy to the poisonings. They needed more. They brought her in for questioning. Stacy was calm, collected, and utterly convincing in her denials. She was a victim, she insisted, a woman cursed with unbelievable bad luck. She suggested that perhaps David had killed himself out of guilt for having murdered her first husband, Michael. It was a wild theory, but she presented it with unnerving sincerity. As the investigation dragged on for 2 years, Stacy knew the net was closing around her. She was intelligent and methodical. She knew the police were building a case, and she knew she needed to create a diversion, a plausible alternative to her own guilt. She decided to create a new suspect. Her choice of a scapegoat was an act of such profound and monstrous cruelty that it elevated her crime from mere greed to something almost inhuman. She decided to frame her own daughter. In September 2007, Stacy's eldest daughter, Ashley Wallace, then 20 and a college student, was at home. She received a call from her mother. Stacy was upset, she said. She suggested they have a few drinks together to talk and relax. She saw it as a mother-daughter bonding moment. Stacy poured them both a drink. She handed one to Ashley. Ashley trusted her mother implicitly. She had been her rock, her confidant, her protector through the deaths of 2 fathers. She drank it. Soon after, a fog descended over Ashley's mind. She felt dizzy, disoriented, and overwhelmingly sleepy. She stumbled to her bed. The next afternoon, Ashley's younger sister, Bree, arrived at the house. She found Ashley unconscious in her bed, near death. And next to the bed on the nightstand was a typed 750-word letter. It was a suicide note. It was a confession. The note, written in the first person as if from Ashley, was a rambling, guilt-ridden account of murder. "I am so sorry for what I have done," it began. "I have become a monster. I killed my dad and I feel so bad about it. I am the one that killed my dad, Michael Wallace. I used a substance called antifreeze. It was a terrible thing to do, but I was young and I was mad at him." The note went on to confess to the murder of her stepfather, David Castor, as well. "After a few years, you remarried. I did the same thing to him. I am so sorry. I did not want to do it, but I did. I can't live with myself anymore." The letter ended with an apology to her mother, Stacy, for the pain she had caused. It was, on its face, the perfect solution to all of Stacy Castor's problems. It exonerated her completely, painting her as the ultimate victim, a mother who had lost 2 husbands and was now losing a daughter who turned out to be a secret, monstrous killer. Ashley was rushed to the hospital in a coma, her life hanging by a thread. Paramedics and doctors worked frantically to save her. For 2 days, Ashley lay unconscious. But she was young and strong. She survived. When she awoke in her hospital bed, confused and groggy, investigators were there to question her. They showed her the note. She was baffled. She had no memory of writing it. The last thing she remembered was having a drink with her mother. As the fog in her mind cleared, a terrifying realization began to dawn. The drink, the sudden illness, the convenient confession letter. It wasn't a suicide attempt. It was an attempted murder. And the person who had tried to kill her, the person who had tried to frame her for 2 murders, was her own mother. The failed frame-up was the final, fatal mistake for Stacey Castor. The suicide note, intended to be her salvation, became her undoing. Forensic investigators descended on the case with a new, powerful piece of evidence. They analyzed the computer from which the note had been printed. They found the document in the computer's memory. And they found a digital fingerprint that was as damning as any DNA. In the note, the word antifreeze was misspelled. It was written as anti-free. The computer's forensic log showed that the author had typed anti-free, deleted it, and then retyped anti-free. It was a unique, idiosyncratic error. Investigators went back and listened to their recorded interviews with Stacey Castor. In her conversations with them, when she spoke the word antifreeze, she pronounced it anti-free. It was a verbal tic, a personal mispronunciation that it cleared Stacey Castor completely and laid the blame for 2 murders squarely on the shoulders of her now dying daughter. It was, for a murderer, a brilliant final move. But Stacey Castor made one critical miscalculation. Ashley Wallace survived. After 5 days in a coma, Ashley woke up. When investigators questioned her, she was adamant. She had not tried to kill herself. She had not written the note. She told them about the nasty-tasting drink her mother had given her the night before she collapsed. Her last memory, she said, was of her mother bringing her a drink on a spoon, telling her it would help her feel better. The foundation of Stacey's perfect alibi began to crack. The suicide note now became the central piece of evidence in the case. The Onondaga County District Attorney's Office, led by prosecutor William Fitzpatrick, launched a forensic deep dive that would expose Stacey's monstrous lie. First, they analyzed the language. The note repeatedly used the word antifreeze. But when investigators interviewed Ashley's friends and family, they learned that Ashley, since childhood, had never called it antifreeze. She had always referred to it by a nickname, anti-free. It was a tiny but profound linguistic fingerprint. The person who wrote the note was not the person who lived Ashley's life. Next, they turned to computer forensics. By examining the timestamps on Stacey's home computer, they discovered that the note had been drafted, revised, and saved over a period of several hours. Crucially, the final version of the note was created at a time when school records proved Ashley was in her classes, miles away from the computer. The person who typed the confession could not have been Ashley Wallace. Finally, she had now transcribed into her daughter's fake suicide note. She had, in effect, signed her confession. In September 2007, Stacey Castor was arrested and charged with the murder of David Castor and the attempted murder of her daughter, Ashley Wallace. She was later indicted for the murder of her first husband, Michael Wallace, as well. The trial in early 2009 was a media sensation. The prosecution, led by District Attorney William Fitzpatrick, laid out the entire chilling narrative, from the death of Michael Wallace to the poisoning of David Castor, culminating in the horrific betrayal of her own child. The star witness was Ashley Wallace. In a moment of high courtroom drama, she took the stand and testified against the woman who had given her life and then tried to take it away. She looked directly at her mother and recounted the story of their shared drink, the last moment of trust before the poison took hold. Throughout the testimony, Stacey Castor sat impassively, staring at her daughter with cold, emotionless eyes. She showed no flicker of remorse, no hint of shame. The defense argued that Ashley was a liar, that she had indeed killed both men and was now trying to blame her mother to save herself. But the evidence of the anti-free misspelling was irrefutable. After deliberating for a day, the jury returned its verdict: guilty on all counts. At her sentencing, Stacey Castor maintained her innocence. continuing to play the role of the wronged woman. The judge was unmoved. He sentenced her to the maximum allowed by law, 25 years to life for the murder of David Castor, another 25 years for the attempted murder of Ashley, and an additional 1/3 to 4 years for forging David Castor's will. She would not be eligible for parole for more than 51 years. She was sent to the Bedford Hills Correctional Facility for Women. For years, she continued to proclaim her innocence from behind bars, giving interviews in which she portrayed herself as a victim of a terrible conspiracy. Her daughters, Ashley and Bree, struggled to rebuild their lives in the shadow of their mother's unimaginable betrayal. On June 11, 2016, Stacey Castor was found dead in her prison cell. An autopsy concluded that she had died of a heart attack. The same cause of death she had used to mask her first murder had, in the end, claimed her. It was a quiet, solitary, and deeply ironic end for the woman the media had dubbed the Black Widow. Her case remains a chilling study in the banality of evil, a reminder that the most monstrous predator can wear the most convincing mask of love, and that there was the glass from which Ashley had been drinking. Forensic analysis found Stacey's fingerprints on the outside of the glass, but they did not find Ashley's. If Ashley had been holding the glass and drinking from it willingly, her fingerprints should have been there. Their absence suggested she never held it, that it was brought to her. The physical evidence told a story of a mother poisoning her child, not a child committing suicide. While Ashley was recovering, the results from Michael Wallace's exhumation came back. Just as Sergeant Norton had suspected, Michael's remains tested positive for ethylene glycol. The cause of his death was not a heart attack. It was murder. Stacey Castor had not just killed her second husband. She had killed her first husband as well, 5 years earlier. In September 2007, Stacey Castor was arrested and charged with the murder of David Castor and the attempted murder of her own daughter, Ashley Wallace. In 2008, she was also indicted for the murder of Michael Wallace. Her trial began in January 2009. The prosecution, led by William Fitzpatrick, laid out the case with meticulous, damning detail. They presented the forensic evidence from the computer, the fingerprints on the glass, the autopsy results. They put Sergeant Norton on the stand to describe the staged suicide scene. But the most powerful moments of the trial came when Stacey's own daughters testified against her. Bree described finding her sister near death. And then Ashley, a young woman forced to confront the fact that her own mother had tried to murder her and frame her for 2 other killings, took the stand. In a voice filled with a mixture of strength and profound sorrow, she looked at her mother and told the jury, "I never wrote that note." Stacey Castor, for her part, maintained her innocence throughout the trial. She gave a television interview in which she calmly suggested that Ashley, in a grief-stricken, drug-addled state, had indeed killed both men and then tried to take her own life out of guilt. She was a master of performance, a woman who could look into a camera and spin a tale of maternal heartbreak while knowing she was the author of all the pain. On February 5, 2009, the jury found Stacey Castor guilty on all counts. Guilty of the murder of David Castor, guilty of the attempted murder of Ashley Wallace, and guilty of forging David Castor's will. She was later indicted for, but never tried for, the murder of Michael Wallace, as she was already facing the maximum sentence. She was sentenced to 25 years to life for the murder, plus an additional 25 years for the attempted murder. At her sentencing, she remained defiant, speaking directly to the court but never looking at her daughters. "I am not a murderer," she said, her voice steady. "I have never been a murderer, and I will not be a murderer." Stacey Castor died in prison of a heart attack in June 2016, the same fate she had claimed for her first husband. She maintained her innocence to the very end. Her case is a chilling portrait of a modern Black widow, a woman who used a common, sweet-tasting poison to eliminate the men in her life for financial gain. But her true legacy of evil lies in the final, desperate act of a predator backed into a corner. The willingness to sacrifice her own child on the altar of her lies. It is a betrayal mother's kiss can sometimes carry the taste of antifreeze. Case 4. The Case of Judy Benoano. Our final story tonight is a chronicle of a woman whose entire adult life was a calculated performance of grief. She was a chameleon of death, changing her name, her location, and her methods, but never her core motive. A chilling and insatiable greed. She was a wife, a mother, a businesswoman, and a pillar of her community. But behind the mask of normalcy was a predator so patient and so prolific that she earned her place in the darkest pantheon of female serial killers. The media would call her the Black Widow, but the name she chose for herself would prove to be the most cynical and revealing of all. She was born Judy Welty in 1943, in Quanah, Texas, into a life of rural poverty and neglect. Her mother died when she was just 4 years old, and she and her brother were sent to live with their grandparents. When her father remarried, she was brought back into his home, only to face a new kind of hardship. Her childhood, as she would later claim, was one of brutal abuse at the hands of her father and stepmother, a grim upbringing of being forced to work like a field hand, of being starved and burned with cigarettes. This history of trauma, while never an excuse for her later actions, perhaps forged in her a deep and abiding resentment, a sense of entitlement to a better life, a life she would become willing to kill for. At 17, she gave birth to a son, Michael, whom she gave up for adoption. It was her first act of severing a familial bond for the sake of her own forward momentum. In 1961, at the age of 18, she married James Goodyear, a sergeant in the United States Air Force. For a time, they lived the life of a typical young military couple. They had 2 children of their own, a son named James Jr. and a daughter, Kimberly. They moved from base to base, from Texas to New Mexico. To her friends and fellow military wives, Judy Goodyear was a charming, capable woman, a good wife and mother. But beneath the surface, a dark ambition was taking root. In 1971, James Goodyear returned home to Orlando, Florida, after completing a tour of duty in Vietnam. He had survived the dangers of war, but he would not survive the peace of his own home. Within 3 months of his return, he began to suffer from a mysterious, debilitating illness. He was plagued by nausea, vomiting, and extreme fatigue. Doctors were baffled, unable to pinpoint a cause. He was hospitalized, but his condition only worsened. On September 16, 1971, Sergeant James Goodyear died. The official cause of death was listed as bronchopneumonia, a complication of his undiagnosed condition. Judy Goodyear, the grieving military widow, collected the proceeds from 3 separate life insurance policies, a substantial sum she had carefully arranged. She also began receiving survivor benefits from the military. The first act of her murderous play was complete, and she had gotten away with it perfectly. With her newfound wealth, Judy began to build a new life for herself. She moved to Pensacola, Florida, and entered into a relationship with a man named Bobby Joe Morris. In 1973, their home mysteriously burned to the ground. Judy collected the insurance money. A pattern was beginning to emerge. Where Judy went, convenient tragedy and financial windfalls seemed to follow. In 1977, she moved to the small town of Trinidad, Colorado, with her children and her new boyfriend, a man named Gerald Dossett. In early 1978, Gerald, like James Goodyear before him, fell victim to a sudden and inexplicable illness. He was hospitalized with symptoms of nausea and vomiting. He died soon after. His death was attributed to natural causes, specifically complications from liver disease. Judy, once again a bereaved partner, collected yet another life insurance payout. After Gerald's death, Judy decided to make a symbolic change. She legally changed her own surname and that of her children to Benuano. It was a Spanish name, she explained, one she had concocted herself. It meant good year. It was a private, macabre joke, a tribute to her first victim and the financial freedom his death had provided her. She returned to Florida in 1979, settling in the panhandle town of Gulf Breeze. She opened her own business, a beauty salon, and cultivated an image as a successful, resilient single mother who had endured more than her share of tragedy. She was respected in the community, but the darkness that had consumed two men was now beginning to turn inward, toward her own flesh and blood. Her son, Michael, the child she had given up for adoption as a teenager, had re-entered her life. He was now a young man, eager to connect with his birth mother. He would not be the only one of her sons to fall victim to her ambition. Her second son, James Jr., who now went by the name Bobby Joe Goodyear, enlisted in the U.S. Army in 1979. Shortly after his basic training, he, too, was struck by a mysterious illness. He was exposed to a poison that left him paralyzed, unable to walk without the aid of heavy, cumbersome steel and leather-legged braces. The poison, doctors would later determine, was arsenic. For months, Judy played the part of the devoted mother, caring for her disabled son, a hero who had been struck down by a cruel twist of fate. In May of 1980, Judy took her son Bobby Joe canoeing on the East River near their home. It was a quiet, peaceful outing. Judy would later tell police that their canoe had unexpectedly capsized. She claimed she tried heroically to save her son, but that he, weighed down by his heavy braces, slipped from her grasp and sank beneath the dark water. By the time help arrived, it was too late. Bobby Joe Goodyear was dead. His death was ruled an accidental drowning. And Judy Benuano, the mother who had now lost a husband, a boyfriend, and a son, collected on yet another life insurance policy, this one for $20,000, which she had taken out on her soldier son. For 3 years, Judy enjoyed her life as a successful businesswoman and a tragic, but brave, matriarch. By 1983, she was engaged to be married again to a man named John Gentry. Gentry was a prominent Pensacola businessman. He saw Judy as a strong, loving woman, and he was ready to build a life with her. But Judy had other plans for him. He was not a partner, he was an investment. She took out a large life insurance policy on him, naming herself as the sole beneficiary. She began her attack subtly. She started giving Gentry vitamin capsules. These pills, she told him, were to help with his health, to build up his strength. What Gentry didn't know was that the capsules contained paraformaldehyde, a toxic chemical that, when ingested, slowly poisons the body. Gentry began to feel sick, but he trusted his loving fiancée. Then, in June of 1983, Judy's patience ran out. The slow poisoning wasn't working fast enough. She decided to escalate her methods dramatically. She told Gentry that she was pregnant and that they should go on a celebratory trip. On June 25, 1983, as John Gentry got into his car to run an errand before their trip, he turned the ignition key. The world erupted. A massive explosion ripped through the car, blowing Gentry through the roof. He landed on the pavement, his body shredded by shrapnel, his abdomen torn open. The bomb, a sophisticated device made of dynamite and C4 plastic explosive, had been wired to the car's ignition. It was designed to kill him instantly, but in a miracle of sheer chance, Gentry survived. He was rushed to the hospital with catastrophic injuries, but he was alive, and he could talk. From his hospital bed, mangled and in agony, John Gentry told police about his fiancée, Judy Benuano. He told them about the life insurance policies. He told them about the mysterious vitamin pills she had been giving him. The car bombing was not a random act of violence. It was a failed execution, and it was the mistake that would finally bring Judy Benuano's reign of terror to an end. The police investigation, now supercharged by the attempted murder of a well-known businessman, began to connect the dots of Judy's dark past. They analyzed the vitamin capsules from Gentry's home and found they contained poison. They traced the materials used in the bomb, the dynamite, the wire, the electrical tape, and found that Judy had purchased identical items from local stores in the weeks leading up to the explosion. The investigation became a domino effect of exhumations. They unearthed the body of her son, Bobby Joe Goodyear. The autopsy confirmed he had been suffering from chronic arsenic poisoning before he drowned. They exhumed the body of her first husband, James Goodyear. He, too, had lethal levels of arsenic in his system. They went to Colorado and exhumed the body of Gerald Dossett. Arsenic. The pattern was undeniable, a trail of poison and death stretching back over a decade. The trial of Judy Benuano was a media sensation. The press dubbed her the Black Widow. The prosecution laid out the staggering timeline of her crimes, painting a picture of a cold, calculating killer who had murdered her husband, her son, and her boyfriend, and had attempted to murder her fiancé, all for the cold, hard cash of insurance payouts. John Gentry, scarred but resolute, testified against her from his wheelchair. Her own daughter, Kimberly, testified that her mother had often joked about poisoning people. In 1984, a jury found Judy Benuano guilty of the attempted murder of John Gentry. She was sentenced to 12 years in prison. But the state was not finished. In 1985, she went on trial again, this time for the murder of her son, Bobby Joe Goodyear. The image of a mother deliberately poisoning her own disabled son and then drowning him was so monstrous that it sealed her fate. She was found guilty and sentenced to death, becoming the first woman to be sent to Florida's death row in over a century. Later, she was also convicted of the murder of James Goodyear. For 13 years, Judy Benuano sat on death row, maintaining her innocence to the very end. She gave interviews in which she claimed she was a victim, framed by the real criminals. She never showed a flicker of remorse. On March 30, 1998, at the Florida State Prison, Judy Benuano was executed in the electric chair. She was 54 years old. She was the first woman to be executed in Florida since 1948 and the first woman in the United States to be executed by electrocution in over 2 decades. Her final words were, "I am innocent, and this is not an execution. This is a murder." The case of Judy Benuano is a chilling study in the art of deception. For years, she wore the mask of a grieving victim, her performance so convincing that she fooled doctors, coroners, friends, and family. She was a woman who saw the people closest to her, the men who loved her, the children she bore not as human beings, but as assets to be liquidated. Her chosen name, Goodyear, stands as a final mocking testament to her legacy. A legacy built on a foundation of poison, greed, and a heart utterly devoid of love. Tonight, we have walked through the desolate landscapes of the human heart, where love is a tool and marriage a means to an end. Belle Gunness, Nanny Doss, Stacey Castor, and Judy Benuano were not driven by sudden passion or explosive rage. They were killers of cold, patient calculation. They perverted the most intimate of human bonds, turning trust into a weapon and the comfort of home into a hunting ground. Their stories serve as a dark and enduring reminder that the deadliest poison is not always the one you can see, but the one administered with a smile, a promise, and a kiss. Sleep well, and may your dreams be untroubled. Good night.